Genealogical Society. As always, we thank our patrons who are with us here on Zoom. We will welcome our viewers on YouTube. And today we have Jarrett
Hi.
Ross as our guest. When taking a DNA test, Jewish genealogists normally find tens of thousands of cousins. This is a result of endogamy, marrying within a community. And this means that a lot of people share lots of genes, and autosomal DNA does not tell you which genes you share with which cousin. And Jared Ross will discuss whether it is possible to use genetic genealogy to uncover how you are linked to your cousins. He will use his own Nunes family as an example. He is the Genia vlogger, and I invite you to watch his entertaining and informative vlogs. He is a professional genealogist, and he has built a special expertise in genetic genealogy. Um, and he is an admin of the Sephardic diaspora group that has us three, David Mendoza, Jared Ross, and me, and Michael Waas in addition as its admins. Welcome, Jared.
Thank you very much, Tone. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So thank you everybody for joining today. As mentioned, I will be discussing success with Jewish DNA, how to overcome issues of endogamy. While there will be a lot of focus on Sephardic ancestry in this presentation, I will also be talking about Ashkenazi research. And a big part of that, which we'll go over, is because there is a lot of similarity and overlap between both groups. So to start, we're going to do just a very simple science lesson of recombination and inheritance. So up here at the top, I'm going to get my highlighter. Up here at the top, we have different people. Change this. We have different people represented by their DNA. So we have, this is a mother, so she has two X chromosomes, and then these are her autosomes. The DNA, the autosomes are the DNA that you're going to be testing through Ancestry or MyHeritage or 23andMe, or the Family Finder test through Family Tree DNA. And then you also have your sex chromosomes, your X or your Y. So here we have a male because X and Y. And so here we have a representation of a son. So we can see how there's a recombination of the different colors that each parent has. And so each of these parents, one side, this red, represents the mother's mother, and then the green represents the mother's father. Over here, we have the blue representing the father's mother and the orange gold representing the father's father. And we can see here the Y chromosome is inherited unchanged. The autosomes for both the mother and the father are recombined. So we have mixture of the grandfather and the grandmother. And the main takeaway here is that each generation, we're getting a mixture of our ancestors' DNA. So that means each generation, the segments get smaller and smaller. So on this side, we have another family. So here we have a mother, X and X, a father, X and Y, and they have a daughter. So here, instead of the daughter getting a Y chromosome from her father like this person did, she got an X chromosome from her father, but it doesn't recombine at all because the father only has one X chromosome. But everything else is recombining for her. So similar over here, now we have a big mixture. But let's say they have children. So they have a daughter and then they have a son, and we see things mix even more and even more. So just to reiterate, the big takeaway here is that the segments of DNA from the ancestors are getting smaller and smaller. So the amount of DNA that you share from your further ancestors, you get smaller and smaller segments. But another thing to note is that that Y chromosome, it's still the same as all the way up to this son's great grandfather, because it's this father to this father, and then we know it's all gold coming from that father. So, but it goes on, and this will be especially important when it comes to Sephardic genetic genealogy. But the segment part is another big part of it, which plays into endogamy. So now we're going to keep continuing this science lesson with the discussion of identical by descent versus identical by chance. And this is just a way to think about the DNA that you're sharing with people. So identical by descent can be summed up by you have DNA shared with another person, and that DNA is identical because you both descend from the same ancestors. So you're both inheriting the same DNA from the same ancestor. So it's identical by descent. The other option is identical by chance. And identical by chance means that you share a segment of DNA with somebody, not because you share that's coming from a common ancestor, but because of the chance of DNA. So this could be basically it's because of likely errors in reading the DNA, which errors can happen in a few different ways. I'm not going to get too in depth with it. But first, there's just reading the DNA, then analyzing the DNA and trying to figure out which segments come from mom, which segments come from dad. And then there can be other issues in terms of the comparisons. But over here to the right, we have a chart that just kind of shows the general idea of identical by descent. We have these three different couples over here, one couple, another couple, and another couple. This couple has a son and a daughter. And for their children, we have their children here, they have this segment in common. And the reason why these people, these cousins, have that segment in common is because they share this ancestry. So that's identical by descent. So the main thing to take away from here is that with Jewish DNA, we are dealing with endogamy, and endogamy is going to cause a spike in identical by chance segments. So in a sense, false positive segments. So this is part of the issue when dealing with Jewish DNA. Now here we have what's known as the shared centimorgan project. And the basic concept with DNA matching is that you look at how much DNA you share with your match, and using the amount that you share, you compare it to a chart like this to get an idea of how may that person be related to you. And so with this chart, you can see here, this is yourself. And then for each person, so here we have a parent, it shows the average amount of DNA they share. And this is in centimorgans, which is just a measurement of DNA. So with a parent, you can share, it's on average 3,485, but you can have a range all the way from 2,376 to 3,720. But then with each different relationship that you have, the numbers change. So with this chart, it uses real world data. They've taken thousands upon thousands of people putting in submissions. And with each of those submissions, they've figured out where these people are, or where these specific relationship distances, what numbers to expect. But the thing is that Jewish DNA is a bit different. I'm going to go back just a second. So this chart, well, they didn't ask necessarily in the beginning about endogamy. They did add that on a little bit later. I don't know exactly how they take that into account, although there is a very in-depth white paper you can look into. They have a lot of links up here, so a lot of stuff you can check out with this. But this is mostly for non-endogamous populations. And so this type of a chart isn't going to be helpful to someone with Jewish DNA. So one question a lot of people may be asking at this point, what is endogamy? Endogamy is generations upon generations of marriage only within a specific population group. And this is going to cause a lot of more shared DNA. So a big question with this is, well, what does endogamy actually look like? Because we always talk about endogamy and marriage within a specific population group for many generations, but what can we see with that? Well, it's mostly two things that are happening over and over and over for hundreds of years, many generations. And that's pedigree collapse. So that's cousins marrying cousins. So, remember, if we're only marrying people within a specific population group, eventually almost everyone in that population group is going to be related to you in some recent way. So if you marry someone else within that population group, you're going to be marrying your cousin. So pedigree starts to happen a lot, but also multiple relations. So it's not just necessarily cousins marrying cousins, but being related to people in 2 or 3 or 4 or more ways. So a great example of this multiple relations is the concept of double cousins. So double cousins is the idea that you have a pair of sisters and they meet a pair of brothers. And one brother marries this sister. So they're not brothers and sisters to each other. The brothers are brothers to each other. Sisters are sisters to each other. They're separate. But one brother marries a sister. The other brother marries the other sister, and they have children. Well, those children are going to be first cousins through their father because their fathers are brothers, but they're also going to be first cousins through their mothers because their mothers are sisters. So this is known as double cousins. And this is something that I know I've seen a lot in the Portuguese Jewish community of Amsterdam, which is the community that I've done most of my Sephardic research in. And in my own family, my Nunes Vaz family, there's one generation where there's a pair of Nunes Vaz brothers marrying a pair of senior Coronel sisters. So all Nunes Vaz descendants descend from both of those families because they were actually double cousins then. So all Nunes Vaz descendants are double cousins to each other because of that. Another concept of multiple relations, which is very common in Jewish families, is the idea of three-quarter siblings. So three-quarter siblings is you have a couple, they have a child, and then one of the spouses dies. Then the spouse that's still alive marries the sibling of the spouse which passed away, and they have a child. Well, the child from the first marriage is a half sibling to the child of the second marriage, but they're also first cousins because the mother that died was the sister of the second wife. And this is a very common thing in Jewish families. So this is what's happening generations after generations after generations. And so this is causing more shared DNA, higher centimorgans amounts, because you're being related in a lot of ways. But the thing to remember is, when you're getting further and further in distance in relation, the amount of DNA segments you're sharing gets smaller and smaller. And this is going to be a big concept in overcoming the issues of endogamy. So what happens is you end up getting lots of distant relations. They add up. And so when we look at charts like we did on the previous slide, it's going to be skewed because we're not just going to be fifth cousins. We're going to be fifth cousins and eighth cousins and 10th cousins, 3 more different ways. And so what would have looked like, let's say, maybe a 60 centimorgan match typically, all of a sudden it's 120 centimorgans. And it's because of all these small little segments. So now we're going to see what endogamy actually looks like. Now, this isn't a Sephardic family, but this is a Dutch Ashkenazi family living in Amsterdam. So one of the beauties about coming from Dutch Jewish ancestry is we can actually trace out the trees to be able to see what endogamy actually looks like. And so this I always use as a perfect example because I also have the DNA to go along with it. So first off, it's kind of hard to read, but I always like to joke. I put it in a right to left style just to give a little homage to Hebrew. So we start over here on the first line. We have Mordecai Levi Drucker and his brother Jacob Levi Drucker. And so then each generation we go down, we have first cousins to each other, second, third, fourth, fifth, all the way down until we get to this Steve Jaron and myself are 12th cousins. So now we go to the next line. This is another family. So Benjamin Swab, same person, his children, Eva and Abraham siblings, first cousin, second, third, fourth, etc., all the way down until Steve is an 11th cousin to my mother, making him an 11th cousin once removed to me. So he's a 12th cousin, an 11th cousin once removed. Now we go down another one. Samuel is the same person, his children, siblings, first cousin, second, third, all the way down until Steve is a 10th cousin to my mother. So a 10th cousin once removed to me. So we know 3 ways through the paper trail. We actually know more than these, but these are the 3 we use, where he's a 10th cousin once removed, an 11th cousin once removed, and a 12th cousin. But when I look at the DNA, Steve Jarrett matches both of my parents. Oh, I knew there was something that was supposed to come up before that. So the known past through the paper trail, all through my mother's paternal line. So it goes my mother, then my grandfather, Myron Nunes Vaz, to his father, Morris Nunes Vaz, and then through my Moscow family, which is the Dutch Ashkenazi family. So all through Jane Moscow. So they're all through just one line, but Steve is matching both of my parents through DNA. So that means even though we know all of these paper trail related ways through my mom's side, we're also related through my dad's side. So my father matches Steve's mother, but not Steve's father. Now, I should also note all of Steve's relations to me are through his maternal grandmother. So here, my father matches Steve's mother, but not Steve's father, 44 centimorgans total. But then my mother matches Steve's father, but not Steve's mother. But it's through Steve's mother that I know the paper trail ways through which we're related. So that means that now we've added, we have these 3 paper trail ways. Then we've added knowing through my father's side. Then we've added knowing that also through my mother's side, but in some other way because it's through Steve's father's side. And then to add on to that, my maternal grandmother. So remember, all of these matches are through my maternal grandfather. Well, my maternal grandmother also matches Steve's father. And you can see how the DNA amounts are all very slightly similar. But basically, this is showing how we have 3 paper trail ways that we're related. Through DNA, it's indicating that we're possibly related in a lot of other ways. And it could be that we are truly related here through these different lines that we're getting the DNA matching from. The difficulty really comes down to, with a lot of the Ashkenazi Jewish family trees, it's very, very difficult to build. And then obviously not all Sephardic communities are able to build out their trees like the Amsterdam community is. But basically, this is what you're looking at, is being related in many, many, many ways. So now I have an example of my mother's DNA matches through family tree DNA. So each column here represents a different thing. First, this is what family tree DNA is guessing based on the amount of DNA, what the relationship is, or about what the relationship is. So they usually give a range or a couple of options. Here is the total amount of centimorgans shared. Here is the largest segment. This indicates whether or not they share an X chromosome. So if you remember from the beginning, fathers, when what they pass to their son is a Y chromosome, not an X chromosome. So that means that when you have an X chromosome match with someone, you can eliminate branches because you know that it can't be through a father's line because there shouldn't be X chromosome inheritance. So that's going to be important with what we're going to talk about. But now this column is the actual proven relationship. So this is what's going to be important, is we're going to see what are they guessing versus what is it actually. And this really shows how endogamy shines with your DNA matches. So the first start off, here's my mom's mom, and then my first cousin, my mother's niece. And when it comes to recent relationships, you usually don't see that much of an issue with Jewish endogamy. Usually it's pretty spot on to what you typically find even with non-endogamous matches. So you can see mother-daughter. Yes, it's a mother. Here you can see they guessed niece. Yes, it's my mother's niece. But then as soon as we get a little bit further out, we have family tree guessing a first cousin, aunt, or niece, but this is actually a second cousin. And you can see with the shared centimorgan project we looked at before, a second cousin range. So the range is 46 to 515 centimorgans, yet this is 220 centimorgans almost over the highest part of that range. And when you're looking at the high end of that range, there's a very low confidence that it truly is that relationship distance. But here we know for a fact this is how we are related, or how my mother is related to this cousin of ours. But this likely indicates that we're probably related to this cousin in a whole different way, possibly closer through another side of our family. And this cousin is a Nunes Vaz cousin of mine. So she descends from the same Sephardic ancestry that I do. We have all the same Sephardic ancestry. But we must also share some Ashkenazi ancestry as well. So here, now we have another cousin. So they're guessing second to fourth cousin. It's really a third cousin once removed. So it's pretty close on, but it's at the high end of the range. So third cousin once removed is pretty equivalent to a fourth cousin. But you can see here that this is a Sephardic cousin. And a lot of these matches that you see here are Sephardic. And this goes to show that a lot of what people talk about with Ashkenazi genetic genealogy translates pretty much to Sephardic genealogy because it's very, very similar in what we see in the matches. So here we have another cousin, a third to fifth cousin, and yeah, they're right on. It's a fourth cousin. But the thing is they say there's an X match, but the way that we know that we're related, which is my mother's father's 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 father, and then this match is father's 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 father through the Nunes Vaz line, tracing back to the, a Nunes Vaz man in the 1700s in Amsterdam. There's no way they should share an X chromosome match, but they do, which means that has to come through some other line, or it could be one of these identical by chance segments, a false positive segment. So now going to the next few matches, we have a lot of different things going on here, and I got to move my little Zoom window so I can actually do it for you. So here we have this one. They're guessing second to third cousin outside the range. It's a fourth cousin. Here another one, second to third cousin outside the range. It's a fourth cousin. Here we have a third to fifth cousin. It's in the range, but at the high end. Fourth cousin once removed. And then same thing here. Fourth cousin to remote cousin, which remote cousin means it could be sixth, seventh, eighth cousin. Once you're getting out that distance, you're kind of sharing a lot of the similar amount of DNA. And we're going to look at a lot of that in a bit. And they're guessing fifth cousin. So often with the Jewish DNA, and notice, you can see a lot of these Sephardic names of these matches in their family, what we're sharing. So this is Sephardic matches, that it's almost always at the high end or over the range. And this is one of the reasons why a lot of folks have difficulty with genetic genealogy for Jewish ancestry, because when you look at this and then you look at the typical charts, like the Shared Centimorgan Project, we would have never guessed a second cousin for this. We would have been looking for way closer and been super, super confused if the paper trail didn't quickly lead to that together. So this is just a really great example of when you're looking at your matches, you really need to consider the higher end of things. So now we're going to look at what's known as the Ashkenazi Shared DNA Survey Project by Laura Diamond, and here's a link to that. If anyone wants me to send a link out afterwards, there might be a few things I mentioned in here that I have a little handout that I can get sent out to everybody. But this is a very similar project to the Shared Centimorgan Project by Blaine Bettinger, which we looked at earlier. But this one is specifically looking at Ashkenazi ancestry. And while it is Ashkenazi focused, the big thing to remember is that we see such similarity to Sephardic results that this is actually useful if you have Sephardic ancestry. So the way that it was taken, they have 6,455 data points at the moment. And when they have people submit, they ask their percentage of Jewish ancestry. So table 1, which we're looking at here, that looks at all data points regardless of Ashkenazic percentage. So whether they were 50%, 25%, 100%, whatever, this has everybody that submitted. Then there's, if it'll let me, table 2, which looks at only the data points of individuals that are 100%. Then another one that's 100, where one individual is 100%, the other is 50%. Then the fourth table where it looks at where both individuals are 50%. Then it's looking at both one's 100% and another's 25%. And then the last is 50% and 25%. And so here's an example of the 100% Ashkenazi ancestry. So you can see how it drops from 6,455 data points down to 4,416. Now, this is something that you can still submit to. And this is something that I would love to see us do possibly with Sephardic DNA as well. So, but this is very, very useful. Now, it's kind of hard to read these tables. I know these are snapshots of the actual tables. So I made this to really show what you can see as you get further and further out with your DNA. So on the left, we have Laura Diamond's Ashkenazic DNA survey, which is really the representation of endogamy. Then here we have the shared centimorgan project, the non-endogamy. And so I put two of the lists, one being the both 100% Ashkenazi Jewish, and then the all submissions option. And so you can see, even just from all submissions to both being 100% Ashkenazi Jewish, the average goes up. Not a lot, but it's always going up every single time. But then same thing when you're looking at just the non-endogamous to the all submissions, it's always going up. But a thing to think about is the average difference, because this is going to really highlight how, as you get further out, that's where the endogamy makes it even more difficult. So when we're looking at just a first cousin difference, it's only about a 7% difference. And it's very possible that you get your first cousin matches for your Sephardic or Ashkenazi side, and it looks pretty spot on. But then first cousin once removed, it gets up to 15.3. Then as you get further out, 22.2 with 39.8, 66%, 67.3, 73.9. And then once it gets past fourth cousins, the amount of data points kind of drop off, and then the data becomes skewed, but it still basically stays pretty high up there. And so this really just illustrates that the closer you are in relation to people when you're dealing with endogamous populations, the less the endogamy is really going to affect how much DNA you expect to share. But the further you go out, the harder it's going to be. And that's often where we're really looking with these, is we're looking for the more distant matches. And so knowing that that's where we're going to see the biggest issues, that's really where it's going to help. And, you know, especially down here with the third cousins, fourth cousins, where, you know, typically you're looking at, you know, well under 100 centimorgans, yet over here you're seeing very close to 100 centimorgans for some of these, just almost doubling or what it is in non-endogamous populations. So big question that people often have is, how do you actually identify endogamous matches? So here I'm going to use an example of myself matching to Debbie Long, who is a big part of the Triangle Jewish Genealogical Society, where I've been vice president for a few years. And here's my match to her at 82 centimorgans with a 13 centimorgan longest segment. Well, I've had both of my parents test, and I've had my maternal grandmother test. So let's see how she compares to them. So to my father, 81 centimorgans with a 13 centimorgan longest segment. So they're matching and pretty close to what I'm matching, but actually less than what I'm matching. Well, then looking at my mom, also matching 63 centimorgans with a 9 centimorgan segment. Well, let's see how she matches to my mom's mom. And here we have 74 centimorgans with a 9 centimorgan segment. And so what you often find with your endogamous matches, and what I mean by endogamous is that these matches, you're matching mostly because you share so many small little segments that would mostly be considered identical by chance, that they're coming up as a match where really your closest relation to them may be about a 10th cousin, if that. So often looking outside of the genealogical window, depending on what population group that you're building out. So this is one of the reasons why with the Dutch Jewish family trees, we can actually figure out a lot of this, because we can get out to the 1600s and sometimes even to the 1500s with some of these family trees. But what about Sephardim? And I know I've kind of been harping on this throughout the presentation already, but basically there's a lot of similarity. And another thing to consider, and I think a lot of us probably will say, yeah, this is my family, is that a lot of people today with Sephardic ancestry are heavily mixed with other Jewish ancestries, especially Ashkenazi. I know that's especially relevant for my Nunes. I don't know if I found cousins or many cousins just from my Amsterdam Sephardic families that do have, 100% Sephardic, but often, we're finding for a lot of people too, it's a big mix. So it's very difficult to decipher between Ashkenazi and Sephardim because of that, as well as the fact that there is also just a lot of overlap just historically, and that is seen genetically as well. One of the reasons why Y-DNA is so prevalent with Sephardic studies at the moment. Another thing I often get asked is about admixtures. Can admixtures identify Sephardic ancestry? And the honest answer is kind of, but not really. They can give a hint of possible Sephardic ancestry, but they're not something that you can use to definitively say that you have Sephardic ancestry. And a joke that often comes across my mind, so I made a whole meme about it, was when you're Jewish, but your admixture shows small Jewish percentages, must be Sephardi. So for anyone who's not familiar, this guy is very, very well known as the "it must have been aliens" guy, because basically anything in history that you can't really explain, well, it must have been the aliens. The pyramids must have been the aliens. So it's kind of that similar thing where a lot of people get in this thinking of, well, I'm expecting all Ashkenazi or something like that, so I'm getting these small percentages of other stuff, must be Sephardi. And it really isn't that case. It could be indicative of possible Sephardic ancestry, but it's never going to be definitive proof. So now let's look at a whole bunch of admixture percentages across various companies from people with varying amounts of Jewish ancestry from different communities. So first, we're going to start out. These are actually my mom's percentages. So she's about 15% Sephardic, about 85% Ashkenazi. And so here we have her ancestry results, and you can see 92% Jewish. They are putting all of the communities as Ashkenazi, although they don't really have any Sephardic Amsterdam community, which I hope they do one, because that would be great. But then you can see all these percentages of all these various Aegean islands, Northern Africa, Egypt, Levant, Malta, Northern Italy, Portugal. So often with people with Sephardic ancestry, you will probably find a lot of these various little percentages because, for one, there's a lot of difficulty deciphering between Sephardic and Ashkenazi DNA. So often there's a big chunk of it that'll get put into the Jewish, or even it'll be called Ashkenazi Jewish readings. But then often you'll still see a lot of these small percentages. So it's not uncommon for people who have this Sephardic ancestry to see these small percentages of various things because of the difficulty of reading it. And especially because there's so few people with 100% Sephardic ancestry, that doing a full study to really be able to decipher the DNA very well, it's near impossible. Hopefully it could be possibly done, and a lot of companies are trying to do it. MyHeritage and Family Tree DNA do that. So we're going to look at some of those too. So here's my mother's family tree DNA results. And so I've kept up the ancestry results over here on the right so you can kind of compare. So we can see 91% Ashkenazi, so pretty similar to the 92%, but here they're giving 7% Italian, less than 2% Middle East and North Africa, and they're tying that to their Sephardic Jewish reading. So we can see that it's kind of, they're not quite sure, even though they're trying to get Sephardic. From everything we know about my mother's family, this Italian peninsula would really be representative of the Sephardic ancestry. Granted, part of the Nunes Vaz line comes from Livorno, but they're only there for a couple of generations, so it shouldn't be showing up in their DNA. So now let's look at her MyHeritage results, and let's clear these out. So at the MyHeritage results, they also try to decipher Sephardic. So here we're getting 85.1% Ashkenazi, 5.7% Balkan, 1.9% Italian, and then 7.3% Sephardic Jewish North African. So the big point really being that when it comes to these admixtures, they can give you hints about what your ancestry may be, but there's a lot of difficulty to deciphering things. There are a lot of errors that can happen along the way. And especially coming from a population group such as Sephardic, whether you're Eastern Sephardim or Western Sephardim or North African Sephardim, there's a very big difficulty in deciphering that DNA, and it often gets thrown all over the place. So now we're going to look at some 100% Ashkenazi readings just to see what it looks like, because people with 100% Ashkenazi, or at least as far as we know, because it could possibly be representative of something. But here we have 98% Jewish and a 2% Eastern Europe and Russia reading, which honestly isn't too surprising for someone of a Eastern European Ashkenazi ancestry. So this is my father. So now let's look at his family tree DNA. Well, all of a sudden, he's getting 94% Ashkenazi Jewish, 6% Italian Peninsula. Now, remember, with my mom's results, she had 7%. So going by the same thinking, would we just say, oh, my dad must have Sephardic ancestry? Well, no, maybe he does in one of the lines where we haven't just traced it far enough, but we can't rely on that. And then he's getting less than 1% Bedouin and then less percent Yemenite Jewish. Now let's look at his MyHeritage results. So now, erase all that. Now he's getting 95.4% Ashkenazi, 1.5% Italian, and 3.1% Mizrahi Jewish. So maybe he does have something going on in his ancestry that we haven't quite gotten to yet. But everything that we know shows that it's Ashkenazi ancestry is for a lot of lines tracing back into the 1700s, which I should say at this point, when it comes to the admixture results, often people will say it's reliable to about 300 to 500 years or so. And the main thinking with that is that most of your DNA, or most of your ancestors from about third or fourth great grandparents and down, you're going to have inherited DNA from them. But once you start to get further past that, about fifth great or sixth great grandparents, you start to get into the realm where you're going to have ancestors that are truly your ancestors, but because of recombination, you didn't inherit any DNA from them, and thus there's going to be no representation of that in your ancestry. Or in your DNA results, that is. So that's why you often hear the 300 to 500 years, because for a lot of people, once you start getting back to about fourth great grandparents, fifth great grandparents, that's when you start to get into the 1700s. And so fifth and sixth great grandparents, that's where you're really starting to get into the 1600s. And so it's really 300 to 500 years is the thought. So in the past 300 to 500 years, maybe he does have something going on. But now let's look at some more Ashkenazi 100% Ashkenazi. So here we have someone 100% Ashkenazi, expected. Go to family tree DNA, 100% Ashkenazi, expected. Then we go to MyHeritage, and then all of a sudden we're getting 90% Ashkenazi and 10% North and West European. Now, North and West European, this is something that I would not really think could be representative of Sephardi necessarily. It's not one I find often with Sephardic results, but this is where part of the thought comes in of, just because you expect mostly Ashkenazi, and we just looked at Ancestry and Family Tree DNA, both saying 100% Ashkenazi, 100% Ashkenazi. Well, now with MyHeritage, a lot of people may think, oh, well, 10% non-Ashkenazi, could that be representatives of Sephardic? And this is where I really want to hit the point in of, it could be representative of so many things. And that's the biggest difficulty with these admixtures is, maybe it is representative of an ancestor that we just didn't know that came from France or the Netherlands or something like that. Maybe it is representative of some sort of Sephardic ancestry we just don't know about, or some Mizrahi ancestor we just don't know about. Or maybe it's just a misread. Or maybe it's something else going on that we're not, maybe there was a specific population group merging into a Jewish community. There's all sorts of things. And so there's too many possible hypotheses that are of equal value. And that's where the biggest difficulty comes in. So the main point being, if you're expecting mostly Ashkenazi for someone, you get a percentage of something else, it doesn't mean Sephardi. So continuing with the 100% Sephardi, here we have another example of somebody else. And this one's on family tree DNA, and they're getting this Magyar, which is kind of a Hungary sort of area. We have the less than 1% Ireland, and then less than 1% Northeastern Siberian. So just kind of examples of 100% Ashkenazim getting non-Ashkenazi Jewish results, and somewhere you do see that. So now let's look at some more mixtures. So here we have someone who's 30% Sephardic, about 70% Ashkenazi, and then we can see about 78%, or they're getting 78% Jewish, and then they're getting a big mixture of Southern Italian, Levant, Arabian Peninsula, Cyprus, Northern Africa, Malta, Sardinia. But a lot of it's kind of adding up close to about the 30% or so. So it certainly makes sense that, this is likely representative of the Sephardic ancestry. So when you do have Sephardic ancestry and you're expecting a certain amount, instead of reading this where you're going, oh, okay, so I must have a 4% Levant ancestor within the past 300 to 500 years, and someone living in the Arabian Peninsula and Cyprus and all that. No, it's really more of the difficulty of reading between these. Now I have a lot more of examples. I'm not going to go as in depth as I have been. So same person, we can see huge mix on family tree DNA, yet 1% Sephardic, even though most of that we'd expect to be of Sephardic ancestry, except for the 70%. Same person again. Now we're getting my heritage. And once again, we are getting a Sephardic reading, and this one's actually the closest, 22.6 to what we'd expect of the 30%, but we are getting these other things in there as well. Now we have someone who's actually 100% Ashkenazi, or sorry, not Ashkenazi, 100% Sephardi. Now, this person does have very distant known Romano ancestry. And I think there was another one, but very distant. But as for many lines, far back, or the majority of lines, it should be 100% Sephardi, and we're getting 60% Italian Peninsula, 7% Ashkenazi Jewish, 24% Sephardic, and then a huge mix of Maghreb and Egypt, Bedouin, Mizrahi, Yemenite, Arabian Peninsula, and then I think there were a few others that were, less than 1%. So we can see here with someone that's expecting 100% Sephardi, even with some of those known distant ancestries, those distant ancestries would only equate to maybe 1 or 2%. Yet we can see it's going mostly to the Italian Peninsula, a good chunk to Ashkenazi Jewish, a good portion they're getting Sephardic. So there's going to be a lot of difficulty with Sephardic ancestry. Now here we see this same person, and here we have their MyHeritage results. So before we were looking at family tree DNA, now we have MyHeritage. They're getting 21.3% Ashkenazi, 19.6 Italian, 12.8 Greek and Southern Italian, 18.2 Mizrahi, only 16% Sephardic, 6.3 Northern African, and 5.8% Middle Eastern. So lots of examples of what you can get. So now let's look at some more. So now we have a cousin of mine who was, her father was of French, and then on her mother's side, she should be about 42.5% Ashkenazi and 7.5% Sephardi. And so this is where it can get really difficult for a lot of people in terms of the people that do have mixed European with mixed Jewish ancestry, where, before you could kind of pick out stuff as, okay, that makes sense that it'd be part of the Sephardi and all of that. But with her Ashkenazi, it's coming up 45.2%. So pretty close to what we would expect. And with the randomness of recombination, maybe that is what she would get as Ashkenazi, but 23andMe doesn't have Sephardi. So it must be some of this other stuff, and maybe it's some of this East Asian, Western Asian, and maybe it is this Southern European, but being that she's also coming from a large French ancestry, a lot of this could be tied to that too. And so there's a difficulty of deciphering things. Now we have somebody 50% European, 35% Ashkenazi, 15% Sephardi, and they're getting a big chunk of that Jewish, and then everything else, it's going to be super hard to decipher because it's all just various versions of European, and maybe that's Spain, but I don't know. Now let's look at some people coming from the Jamaican communities. So here we have a cousin of mine from the Nunes family, where she comes from the Jamaican community. Her family line traces back to Jamaica in the 1700s. She has 62.5% about Ashkenazi, about 25% Sephardi, about 12.5% European. And we can see that with this mixture, it's going to be very difficult to really decipher. This is coming from Ancestry, now 68% Jewish. We could possibly tie some of that Spanish into the Sephardi, and we could possibly tie the Levant or even the Arabian Peninsula or Portugal. But it's just, this is the difficulty is, what do you pick and choose and what's coming from where? And so here, I just want to harp on the fact that with these admixtures, while a lot of people find them the main thing that they DNA test for, and while there is a use to them in getting hints of possible ancestry, especially for people of mixed ancestry, it can be almost useless in actually figuring out your genealogy because of just the difficulty of reading. So now we're going to look at two more readings, and these are siblings coming from the Jamaican community as well, and they have a much different mix. So they're 65% African, 20% European, 6.25% Sephardic, and about 6.25% Ashkenazi. And they just have a massive, massive array of just all sorts of stuff all over the place. And it's especially difficult, what do you tie to the Ashkenazi versus the Sephardi? And, they do have 9%, but we're expecting 6.25% for both Sephardi and Ashkenazi. So just kind of just showing a lot of these admixtures. So I know that's that's kind of a lot. So now we're going to get into what are ways to actually use your Jewish DNA results. And we're going to start with kind of the most basic, which will give good examples of what to see with DNA matches again. But then we're going to get into some of the more advanced. And with some of these examples, some will be on Sephardic families, some will be Ashkenazi families. But the thing to remember is that in terms of the numbers of the genetic genealogy, it's all very similar. So the first thing we're going to look into is confirming the paper trail. And that's really, find known relatives in your matches, get relatives to test, and identifying a non-paternal event. But basically all you're doing is just taking the DNA matches that you have or the cousins that you see that they're matching you at what you expect, unless you confirm the paper trail, or if you identify a non-paternal event, then you're disproving the paper trail. So a non-paternal event just basically means that the ancestry you expect isn't the actual genetic ancestry. Then after that, we're going to talk about testing a hypothesis. So coming up with a hypothesis in your genealogy and then using DNA to test it. So that could include unknown parentage or just unproven connections. And we'll talk about why DNA for Sephardic ancestry with that and how I use that in the Nunes Vaz family. But then the big meat and potatoes of it, which I think everyone wants mostly, is the expand your family tree. So identifying your significant matches, which matches are the ones that you're most likely to actually find a genealogical connection, then creating a hypothesis using that DNA match, and then correlating with further DNA testing in the paper trail, basically trying to prove your new hypothesis based on this match. So first, let's go to the simplest one, confirming the paper trail. Here we have my family, myself, my mom, my grandfather, my great-grandfather, and then all these cousins. And the red indicates that we've DNA tested. So myself, my mom, Jay Kerber, and N. Cohen, we've all done DNA testing. We all match at what we expect. Thus, we have then confirmed that Abraham Nunes Vaz and Jane Moscow are the ancestors of all of us. We can take that further, and through Jane Moscow, we have another cousin who tested. He matches all of the other cousins at what we would expect, and thus we prove Morris Moscow and Esther Dahan. Well, with the Sephardic family trees, I'm going to go much further, but part of the point is going to be look at how much DNA each match is sharing. So this is through lines on Ancestry. So if you DNA test on Ancestry and then connect your family tree to your DNA results, you will be put into through lines where basically it's an AI algorithm that figures out how you should match these people based on the tree your DNA is connected to and how your DNA is all matching each other. So here we're quickly, easily proving Abraham Nunes Vaz is my mother's great-grandfather. So here's my mother, Sandra. Here we have this cousin, a second cousin once removed, 159 centimorgans. This cousin, a second cousin, 285. And then another second cousin, 236 centimorgans. So we all know we're cousins, and Abraham Nunes Vaz is our shared ancestor. So this is a great grandfather level for my mom. So now let's look at a second great grandparent level. So now this is Abraham Nunes Vaz's mother, Reina Robles. And so I know this one's a lot smaller, so hopefully it's easily readable for you all, but it was kind of a bigger tree, so harder to fit everything. But you can see instantly as you get out to the third, fourth, fifth cousin level, how the DNA can drop significantly. So first, let's look at this third cousin, 133 centimorgans. That is a very high amount for a third cousin. So this cousin has a lot of shared DNA with us, possibly just because of the randomness of recombination, but also very possibly because of the endogamy. Then we have another third cousin at 61 centimorgans. Then over here, we have a whole multitude of generations where you can see the drop. So we see here 131 centimorgans, then his child or her child 59 centimorgans, then their child 22 centimorgans. So you can see within a few generations, it drops significantly. So this third cousin, once removed, shares 22 centimorgans. But when you're dealing with the endogamy, because we have pages upon pages upon pages of DNA matches, if we didn't have the family trees easily built out, which a lot of Ashkenazi families would have difficulty getting out to an ancestor born at this time. Some can, but especially finding a lot of the relatives, try to find a 22 centimorgan match and find that significant. But then look at some others. Another third cousin once removed, only 32 centimorgans. A third cousin, 66 centimorgans. Now here we have a third cousin once removed of 46 centimorgans. And then a third cousin twice removed at 9 centimorgans, and their parent, a third cousin once removed at 18 centimorgans. So you can see, even once we're out to a point of trying to identify our second great grandparents, the DNA can drop off to where you may have cousins that it's going to be so difficult to find them. But we'll talk about some tricks to possibly start to find some of these matches. But one thing I want to point out, which will be important, is look at how much of the DNA they have and how many segments they have, and basically what's the average amount of each segment. So as you look through, take note of what do you notice about the average amounts of those segments often. So now we're going to go to the next page. So we're looking at second great grandparent. Now let's look at a third great grandparent. So now we're looking at Reina Robles' mother, Rachel Enriquez Pimentel. And so here we have my mom again. And we were just looking at all those 18 matches. Well, now here we have the more distant matches. And look at how things drop down still. Fourth cousin, 12 centimorgans. Fourth cousin, 33 centimorgans. But then, hey, look, we have a fourth cousin once removed at 40 centimorgans. Even more than what we had with some of those third cousins. And then another fourth cousin at 40 centimorgans. Now we're looking at a third great grandparent. Let's take it further. Let's look at a fourth great grandparent. So now we're going to jump to a different line of the family of mine. So my Lopez Diaz line. So here we have Isaac Lopez Diaz, my mother's fourth great grandfather. So here's my mother. And so she's one of 37, or I guess she has 37 DNA matches. So one of 38 known ancestry DNA testers who descend from Sarah Lopez Diaz, who married a Nunes Vaz. But through Sarah Lopez Diaz's siblings, and this one is a half sibling. So here we have a fifth cousin, 10 centimorgans, a fifth cousin, 12 centimorgans, a half fifth cousin once removed, 11, half fifth cousin, 17, and then another half fourth cousin once removed, 21 centimorgans. But even though we're sharing these segments, one of the things to think about is now that we're this far back, we're starting to get into the range where it's very possible that we share multiple sets of ancestors. So that's something we have to consider with these small segments. Are all of these coming from our shared ancestry through Isaac Lopez Diaz? Or do some of these others, like let's say the Oeb Brandon family, which I know I descend from the Oeb Brando family, they also descend, this match descends from it. So our DNA match could be through the Lopez Diaz line, or maybe it's through the Oeb Brando family. So there's a lot to consider even once you start to get out this far. But hey, let's take it even further. Let's go up to a fifth great grandfather, to the Senior Cornell family, another line of mine. So here's my mother tracing up to her fifth great grandfather. And here we see a whole lot of segments. I've got to move this stuff. but we've got a fifth cousin once removed and 9 centimorgans, a sixth cousin at 16, a sixth cousin at 11. So we're getting really distant, but notice how once we're out at that third cousin range, fourth cousin range, then we start to drop, and then it's just kind of the matches we get are similar. But the truth is we probably have a lot of cousins through these lines that are in the ancestry database, but because of recombination, we don't share any DNA. So we truly are relatives. We just don't share DNA. These are the matches, the cousins, where we do just happen to share DNA, but there is that question, is it through the senior Cornell line, or do we share another ancestry where we may be sharing that, especially it's such a small amount? So now I want to get into some advanced DNA testing stuff, and that has to do with DNA Painter. So here is a DNA painting of mine. And so each chromosome or set of chromosomes are painted. And what I have here now is singling out my maternal line. So going before, you can see 2 chromosomes on each side, one being my father, one being my mother. Here I'm singling it out to just my maternal line. And so you can see in this box the ancestors where I'm getting it from. So my grandmother is tested, which gives me a lot to view in terms of being able to DNA paint. But then I also have cousins where basically these are our shared ancestors. So my uncle and some first cousins have tested. So we share Myra Nunes Vaz and Betty Ekoff as our ancestors. Then these are the cousins when you see green where that's our shared ancestors and so on. So you can see it goes back to my 4th great grandparents, Abraham Nunes Vaz and Sarah Lopez Diaz. So looking at specific chromosomes, here we're looking at my 20th chromosome from my maternal side. So this blue segment, that is my grandmother. But then notice here we have a match between myself and one of my cousins. And then we have a match between myself and a cousin through Abe Nunes Vaz, Abraham Nunes Vaz, and Jane Moscow, my 2nd great grandparents. So I know that this is through my grandparents, but now I can be confident that not only is this section through my grandfather, because I'm sharing it with a cousin through the Nunes Vaz side, but also because it's matching up with this line, I can be much more confident that it's also through my grandfather's father. So Myra Nunes Vaz and Betty are my great grandparents, or sorry, not my great. They're just my great. I shouldn't say great. They're my grandparents. I need to take a little energy drink. Give me a second. Okay. They're my grandparents, and Abe Nunes and Jane Moscow are my 2nd great grandparents. So I don't have any second cousins that I tested where I can do the chromosome comparisons, unfortunately. Trying to get them to do it. But we can tell that, okay, so this is from my grandfather. This is from my 2nd great grandparents. So I can also say that this segment's coming specifically from my great grandfather. So over time, if you can get enough DNA matches to test, you can start to reconstruct your ancestor's genome, because I can take this segment where I know where I'm matching with these cousins. I know it's from my great grandfather Morris, so I can slowly piece that together. But then look, we have this chromosome, this segment right here. So we have that coming from my 3rd great grandparents, Raphael Nunes Vaz and Reber Robles, so the parents of Abe Nunes. So while this green segment, we know that it's either Abe or Jane, we can be very confident, we can be very specific that this part comes specifically from my 2nd great grandfather, Abraham Nunes Vaz. Now, this gets even more useful when you're doing DNA matching, because as you start to look at your matches, if you're testing through a place where you can look at the chromosome browser, which is pretty much everywhere except for Ancestry and 23andMe, if you find someone where they're not quite sure about their ancestry, and then all of a sudden you line up the segments, you can be like, well, this segment's lining up with this side of my family. So if you are related to me and this is a identical by descent segment, then this must be how we're related through this line. So if I found a match, I'd be able to match that lined up right there. I'd be like, oh, probably a Nunes Vaz cousin, or at the very least, from the Western Sephardic ancestry I have. But now here we're looking at the 19th chromosome. Now remember, this blue is my grandmother, but then look, we have my maternal grandfather's ancestry, Abe Nunes Vaz. And that's lining up right there. So what does that mean? Well, that means that this segment is very possibly a segment that's from a different line that I'm related to with this cousin. So this cousin and I descend from Abe Nunes and Jane Moscow, but we may descend from some other line that may be through my grandmother, but it also may just be a misread. It might be one of those identical by chance segments. So that's where the difficulty really comes in. And that's where you can actually start to, with the advanced DNA painting, start to identify segments, which you may go, you know what? That segment doesn't match up with what it should be in the family. So that must be representative of something else, some other relation or some sort of identical by chance segment. There's a lot of difficulty with DNA painting, especially with Jewish ancestry, but it can be quite useful, as you can see, where you can quickly tell this is going to be from these specific ancestors. So now I'm going to talk about testing a hypothesis. So before we just did a lot of confirming the paper trail. So now testing a hypothesis. So this is going to be an Ashkenazi line, but just kind of a quick show. So in the 1900 census for my family living in Vineland, New Jersey, we had this Bessie Obschuyler. And I didn't really think much of it because it listed her as a boarder. And most of the time we see stuff like that in US censuses of, boarders living in houses, and they may not be related to the family. So, in the past, now I don't do it as much, kind of just gloss over it. But then I noticed, wait, she's only 9 years old. That's kind of odd for a boarder, someone living on their own with another family, to be 9. So I thought this must be something more. So I started to look into Bessie and try to identify her family tree to see, is there a matchup to my family tree? Oh, there we go. So here's my line. So tracing up to my Ekoff family. So that was the census record we were just looking at, the Ekoff family. Well, I'm looking at Bessie's family. Her mother was listed as a Clara Dudas. So we have a surname matchup with my great grandmother, Fanny Dudas. So the hypothesis basically is, okay, well, based on the amount of DNA that we're matching, how much we're expecting to share, and the Dudas name, my guess is Fanny and Clara are siblings. So this is the hypothesis that we want to try to prove. So Clara would thus be the daughter of Yaakov and Bessie. So we'd want to get a descendant to test. Unfortunately, with Bessie, she had no descendants, but she had a sister who did. And those descendants tested, R Gibraltar and A Gibraltar, and they matched up with myself, my mom, and my grandmother. It is exactly what we'd expect. And thus we were able to prove it. And so this is something we can use with Sephardic families, where if you are building out the family trees and you find a record that links another family and you just can't quite get the paper trail to match it up, well, you can try to use DNA to match that. Well, one thing to consider with Sephardic families is obviously we have, for a lot of us, at least considering from the Western Sephardic diaspora, sorry if there's others in here that can't trace quite as well as us, but we're often dealing with questions in the 1600s and 1500s and, sometimes even more recent. But when you're dealing with that, the autosomal DNA, these ancestry tests and 23andMe and such aren't quite as helpful. So we want to do Y-DNA testing. And that's what I did with my Nunes Vaz family. We did a Y-DNA project. So this was done through the Avatanu Western Sephardi Y-DNA project run by Adam Brown and Michael Waz. Michael mentioned before is the other admin of the Sephardic diaspora group, along with myself, Tone, and David. And then Adam, I know, has spoken to the group many times. Very, very amazing researchers. And they have been a big part of doing this research. So with the Y chromosome, that shows that patrilineal line. Remember when we talked before, that Y chromosome went from father to son almost unchanged. It very rarely has a mutation. And because of that, that's how we can kind of figure out these patrilineal connections. So the hypothesis that we had was that we had all these different branches of Nunes Vaz family members that were part of Western Sephardic communities. So the hypothesis was that each branch of the Nunes Vaz family was from the same paternal family, and thus, if that's the case, they should match through Y-DNA. So we had 6 main branches to test. We have the Italian branches, which there are 2 branches from. There's the Dr. Abram Nunes Vaz branch and the David Nunes Vaz branch. Now, there are other branches as well with the Italian family. We're still trying to piece that together. I kind of had that on the back burner. I need to get back into it. But then, along with the Italian branches, we also have the Dutch branch. So this is my branch. We all descend from Jacob Nunes Vaz, born 1697 in Livorno, died 1742 in Livorno as well, but all of his descendants being in Amsterdam, or at least all the descendants that we know about, because some of these other branches may actually descend from him. That's one of the hypotheses we have. Then we have 2 Jamaican branches. So we have a Jacob Nunes Vaz branch and a Phineas Nunes Vaz branch. So some of those Jamaican results that we saw before come from this branch. And then here we have another branch, the Suriname branch, which comes from Ishak Nunes Vaz, born about 1755, died 1785. And some of the other Jamaican, I called them Jamaican because they lived in Jamaica, but some of the other families or results we saw come from that branch. So the aim is to get a male patrilineal descendant of each one of these 6 branches, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, to DNA test. Why DNA test? If our hypothesis is correct, they will match. We've had multiple Dutch descendants of the family do Y-DNA testing. In fact, we found multiple new branches of the family because they did DNA testing, and we're able to confirm they were from the Dutch side. Then we also had the Jamaican, both Jamaican branches, we had descendants test. They matched up exactly. So while we're still working on the paper trail to figure out how they connect with the Dutch branch, we know that they do, and we should be able to find it probably sometime in the 1600s, maybe 1500s. Now, for the Suriname branch, unfortunately, we're still looking for male descendants. The only known descendants through Ishak were through female descendants, so we're hoping that maybe some will turn up. Recently, I actually connected with somebody who was doing autosomal DNA testing for some of her cousins, and then figured out that she was actually from their cousins were from the Suriname branch. And so I'm kind of hoping this new branch might actually have some Vaz descendants to do the Y-DNA testing, but not quite sure. And then for the Italian branches, still working to get them to do it. Unfortunately, while we do have descendants of both lines, just haven't gotten them to agree to do it yet. We've gotten them fascinated though. But we've been able to at least prove the Jamaican and the Dutch branch. And based on everything I've seen and the uniqueness of the Nunes Vaz name, even within the Western Sephardic communities, it certainly seems that we're probably going to see those line up. But until we do the Y-DNA testing, we're just not going to know. All right, so now we're going to talk about identifying significant matches. And this is where it becomes really useful just in terms of how do you go through your match list to figure out which are the matches you want to look into. And the big thing is using segments. I know I've harped on this a few times, but as you get further and further in relation to people, those segments get smaller and smaller. And because of endogamy, we see lots and lots of small segments adding up to be a larger total. So what we want to focus on then is long segments, big segments, because if you're being related in just a lot of distant ways, you'd really only see a lot of small segments. But if you do have a closer relation of maybe a second or a third cousin or fourth cousin relationship, then you'd expect probably a much larger segment. So using the longest shared segment that you have with each of your matches can help you figure out which matches you might be better looking at. So if you're looking at matches that are less than 10 centimorgan, their longest segment is less than 10 centimorgans, it's a very low confidence match. Doesn't necessarily mean you won't find a paper trail connection, but it's very unlikely that you will. 10 to 20 centimorgans, you're getting a medium confidence. They're still not quite super confident, but you can be a bit more confident that, yeah, you might actually be able to find something and it's not just a bunch of small little endogamous and IBC segments adding up. Once you get to 20 to 30 centimorgan segments as your longest, then you get really high confidence. And once you get above that, you've got very strong confidence. But the thing is this is only a guide and it is not a hard and fast rule. So you may find a really significant match that's under 10 centimorgans for their longest segment, but you might also find a match that has a 20 some odd centimorgan longest segment, and you just feel like you just can't figure out how you're related. So it can go either way, but this is a great way to figure out how to readjust which matches you look at. Another continuing on that segment idea is the average length of segment. So if you remember before, I mentioned as we we're looking through the through line matches to my mom, what's that average segment amount? And while it wasn't always, it largely was going to be a 10 centimorgan average or higher. And that's what I've noticed with my Ashkenazi matches and the Sephardi matches, is that with our average length of the segment, it's almost always 10 centimorgans or higher, not always. So that's a great way, especially with new matches that come in, to figure out, is this a really good match? So if you have a match that's 100 centimorgans across 5 segments, well, that's a 20 centimorgan average segment size, and that's a really good match. And so you really want to look into that 100 centimorgan match. But then on the flip side, let's say you get a 150 centimorgan match, but it's across 18 segments. Well, that's, even though it's a higher amount of total DNA, there's that segment average size is less than 10 centimorgans. So even though we have a 150 centimorgan match and a 100 centimorgan match that we talked about before, I'd look at the one with that 20 centimorgan average before I'd look at the one with the under 10 centimorgan average, even though that under 10 centimorgan average had a higher total. Another big part is shared match centimorgan comparison. Now, you can only do this on MyHeritage and 23andMe. Ancestry does not have this capability, and Family Tree DNA, at least at the moment, does not have this capability. But basically, this is just the idea of when you look at the shared matches that you have with a match, you want to see how much you're matching your match, as well as how much the shared matches are matching your match. Because you can use that to figure out what are the matches that you want to look into. Because when you're looking at your DNA matches, a big part of it is if you can find matches that are related to each other and figure out how they're related to each other, presumably you should be related through that same line through which they're related. So in the same sense that, you know, if you have a bunch of your second cousins, or let's say from my Nunes Vaz family, I have so many cousins tested that every time a new Nunes Vaz cousin tests, I can look at the match list and I can easily see all the Nunes Vaz shared matches. And I notice that all of their shared match amounts are usually on the higher end. But then you'll see also amongst all those shared match lists, you'll see all these other matches where you're sharing, you know, 100 centimorgans with that match, but then the shared match is only 15 centimorgans or 20 centimorgans or really small ones. So that's the idea with shared match centimorgan comparison, is looking at the matches where you're both matching that shared match at a significant amount. And once again, just to harp back on this, it's only a guide, all of these, not a hard, fast rule. So, you know, if you find a match that the average length of the segments is under 10 centimorgans, it doesn't mean rule it out. It just means might not be a useful match, or there's a lower confidence it's a useful match. That's a better way to put it. But, you know, so it's just a matter of what's the matches that you want to look into because they have the most potential to actually solve and break through something in your family. And something to note is that each endogamous population is different. But when it comes to the Jewish populations, at least Ashkenazi and Sephardim, there's a lot of similarity. But if you also come from, let's say, a French Canadian ancestry or Louisiana Cajun or maybe Pacific Islander or something like that, those population groups, while you can use similar sorts of concepts with the segments, the amount of the centimorgans used for your low confidence versus high confidence is going to change. So like for people with Louisiana Cajun ancestry, we often have to increase these where, you know, less than 20 centimorgans is low confidence for them. And you're looking at average lengths of segments that are 20 centimorgans. And things like that. So while I'm sure most everyone on this is probably looking at just Jewish ancestry, always like to note it because that is a question of can this be used for other stuff. Now, all of these concepts I just talked about were put into a new tool that's on GEDmatch Pro, or sorry, not GEDmatch Pro, GEDmatch Tier 1. GEDmatch Pro is a different thing for investigative genealogy. But GEDmatch, if you're a Tier 1 member, there's what's known as the auto cluster. Basically, the auto cluster is a tool that looks at your matches and the shared matches and clusters them together. And the idea is that each cluster represents a branch of your family. So everyone within that cluster should have the same shared ancestors. And so with most Jewish auto clusters, it looks like this one, the before. And so it's just a huge puzzle of all these people because they're all being shared matches. But when we apply those rules from before with this new tool, which allows you to adjust expected average segment size, the amount of longest segment shared, and other things, then all of a sudden we have this auto cluster that you see on the left all of a sudden turn into this auto cluster on the right. Now we have clusters we can work with. We have, okay, so we'll look into these 3 matches because presumably they should all have the same shared ancestry that I have shared with each one of them. And then same with each cluster. So something to check out and play around with. It's a very new tool. I have a video on my YouTube channel where you can watch about this. It's on my channel, Genie Vlogger, which I'll have a link at the end. But something that can be quite helpful in figuring out new clusters of people to look into. But now I'm going to show an example. Now, this is an Ashkenazi family, but just to harp on it again, even though it's Ashkenazi, the same rules apply to Sephardi. So looking at matches to my mom, this was very early on before I had my grandmother tested, my mom's mom. And so I found this match, 136 centimorgans, but this is what stood out, a 51 centimorgan segment. Remember when I said over 30 centimorgans was a really high confidence? Well, 51 centimorgans, that's like, I got to look at this real quick. So the way I found this was on Family Tree DNA, you can literally sort by longest segment. You can do that on a few of the other databases. Great technique if you've never done that when looking at your match list. Just sort by longest segment. You'll be surprised what might pop out. So found this and wanted to look into the match. So what am I going to do now that I've identified a match that I want to actually look into? Well, first off, I want to hypothesize the approximate relation based on the centimorgans. How much should we expect to be related? What's our relationship distance? So in the beginning, we talked about that shared centimorgan project and the Ashkenazi DNA survey, which give you the hints of the ranges. So using that information, we can try to figure it out. So with 136 centimorgans with endogamy, that's usually around a third to fifth cousins. But because there was this really long segment, I was going to estimate fourth cousins because usually remember, we estimate at the higher end. So if it's about a third to fifth cousin range, probably around fifth cousins. But with such a large segment, I felt it had to be close because it's very rare to have that largest segment go generation after generation unrecombined in both family lines. Because remember, both my mom and this cousin have to have inherited that large segment. So now that I've estimated fourth cousins, now we start to build and look for common names and family locations. So I'm going to try to bring it out to a third great grandparent distance because we've estimated fourth cousin distance. You share third great grandparents with fourth cousins. So if we are fourth cousins and I identify all of my third great grandparents, then that means that one of those sets of third great grandparents should also be this cousin's ancestors. Now, this is a weird one to kind of have because this applies more to the Ashkenazim. And I know with Sephardic genealogy, surnames are kind of a sore spot because it's very often misunderstood, which I know a lot of us have dealt with. But still something worthwhile to note is think about surnames phonetically. And at this point, I will actually talk about my Nunes Vaz family, where we had one line that was part of the Hutz movement. I know some people call it the Chutz or Chutz movement. So that's the Dutch migration or the migration of Dutch Jews to London in the mid 1800s, moving mostly to the East End, working as cigar rollers and hat makers and shoe lasters and things like that. Well, one of the Nunes Vaz families, moved to London. Daniel Nunes Vaz married into a non-Jewish family, changed their name from Nunes Vaz. Remember, Portuguese Nunes, not Nunez, the Spanish style Nunes. And so then they changed it to Nunas. And so then the descendants from there always knew it as Nunes. Then when we did DNA testing, a lot of those descendants started to notice a lot of Nunes Vaz cousins coming up as matches. We started to do the genealogy, and then I was able to connect through the birth record of Daniel Nunes in London through the birth record of Daniel Nunes Vaz in Amsterdam, that was the same person, and was able to connect it that way. So even though surnames are a sore spot, that phonetic thing can be very useful. So another thing, and this kind of applies more to the Ashkenazim, but just to mention here, always look at locations within about 30 miles of what, I think that's about 15 kilometers or so of your ancestral towns. So, that's going to just give you an idea of where people move around a lot. So in building out the trees, this is my family line tracing up to my Casino family. So my mom to my maternal grandmother and up. And then here's the family that I identified for this new match. And that is the Kazanovich family. So Casino, Kazanovich, I thought that was similar. And with the DNA match, that was my hypothesis, was that must be where we are. And so the families were in the same area. One was in, keeps making me do this. One was in Kyiv, Ukraine, in an area called Fastov. Another was in an area outside of Kyiv called Vassal Kyiv. And the presumption was they were Erez Casino, my second great grandfather, and then this Isaac Kazanovitz. They were either brothers or cousins. And this was based on that fourth cousin distance we estimated. So now, any other matches from this branch of her family tree? And can we test anyone to better determine the relation? At this point, my grandmother hadn't tested, so this was the impetus to be like, hey, Graham, test. As well, another big thing is contact the cousins. I hadn't contacted the match yet. I usually try to get an idea of what's going on before I contact them. And one thing I always say is when you do try to contact people, email and social media is often the best because it gives people the opportunity to look into it, see, get a feel for it. I think this applies mostly to especially my American audience, because I know with a lot of my American audience, I know a lot of people like to try to do the cold call style, which you can try, but it is very jarring. And especially in today's day and age, someone calling up and being like, I'm your cousin, a lot of people go, oh, you're not going to scam me. So, email, social media, that gives you that kind of leeway a bit. But another thing, look for those active in the genealogy community, especially with Facebook groups and, all the different groups you can join. Sometimes you can find that. And that's what I did here. So I do not recommend sending emails like this to people unless they are into genealogy. You send something like this to people that aren't into genealogy, you're going to scare them away unless they're really willing to dive in. But basically, I found Evan Wolfson, who was very into genealogy, found him in a lot of the groups, and I found him on genie.com. So I sent him this extensive message basically saying everything that I had figured out and that it was based off of the DNA testing that I had with the one cousin. So from there, he jumped in and started to help me do more research. So we started to build out the family tree and started to actually expand on my line through some paper trail stuff. So we found Harris Casino, my second great grandfather's father, Dov Bear. We also found his anglicized version of his name, Barney. So just to jump back, really difficult to read, but this is his gravestone, which says Svi, son of Dov Bear. And then this we correlated with that gravestone. And this shows Father Barney, but also shows Mother Ides. So now we know Harris's father's Hebrew name and anglicized name. And based on what we knew of Isaac's family, it was doubtful that they were brothers because they had different fathers and mothers. Isaac's parents were a Pincus and Simi. Here for Harris, we have Barney and Ides. So now we're going to readjust our hypothesis to first cousins, uncle, nephew, or similar relation. So just as you're going through, once you've identified that match, once you have a hypothesis, you have to be ready to change that hypothesis and be open to disproving yourself. And often even it's better to try to disprove your hypothesis than prove it. What can you do to prove that that's not the guy? Is there another guy with that same name or something like that? But then can we find any documentation showing an actual link? And at this point, my grandmother's test came in. She was matching at 146 centimorgans with a 67 centimorgan segment. So that segment got even bigger. And so that new test just showed us, yeah, we were on the right track. It was through my grandmother's family. So just a fun slide I always like to show. My second great grandfather, Harris Casino, the ancestor on the other side, Isaac Kazenovich. And even though they're very degraded photos, I think they look very similar face shape, kind of similar beards, similar kind of nose, similar ears with the like kind of jutty out ears sort of thing. But then also both of their granddaughters, my great aunts, and then one of Isaac's granddaughters, I thought they looked alike. I always like to show this because it's just always fun to kind of look at similarities, but not always reliable to determine if there's a relation through resemblance, but just kind of a fun thing to show just because, it's fun. So now let's investigate the hypothesis. So first, what do we actually know? Harris Casino is the son of Dove Bear, Barney Casino, and Ides Casino. If the relationship is correct, then Harris's birth surname was Kazenovich. So same thing we used for the Nunes family. The presumption was they were Nunes Vaz. If that's true, then Nunes was originally Nunes Vaz. So same thing here, Casino would have originally been Kazenovich. Isaac Kazenovich is the son of Pincus Kazenovich and Simi Abrams. If Isaac and Harris are first cousins, then Dove, Bear, and Barney and Pincus are brothers. So it's literally just taking small steps through this. If we know this, then what does that mean? It means this. And if that means this, then that means this. So now just create a hypothesis tree of what we're looking at, because visualization, at least for me, is always super helpful. So here we have my second great grandfather Harris. We have Isaac Kazenovich and his parents. We have Harris's parents. And then this is the presumed connection. So now we have it visualized and we can get a better idea of what do we want to look for. So search the paper trail. And at this time, we lucked out in that records in Kiev were being digitized by Alex Rakovsky. We found this revision list, which I'm guessing a lot of people can't read Cyrillic. So let's look at it in English. And so we have Mordko Kazenovich is the head of the household. He's the son of Itzko Kazenovich. We have his sons, but then we have Berko, a brother of Mordko. Now, the thing to think about is the name Dove Bear, Hebrew name, would be commonly Berko in Russian Empire at this time, but present-day Ukraine. But something to consider for Sephardic families too. If you're looking at a family living in London, but you're expecting them to have lived elsewhere, you may find a different name. So like I know for a lot of my family, a lot of the Dutch family, there were names like, I'm going to butcher this, but like Shuntja, where it would be Jane in England. And in fact, it like even like the surnames too, Nunes Vaz to Nunes, or, Lopez Diaz, they just change it to Lopez or Diaz or things like that. But just that variation. So Berko matches up to Bear. So sons of Berko, Gershko and Itzko. Well, Gershko lines up with Hirsch, which my second great grandfather Harris, his Hebrew name was Hirsch, Zvi Hirsch, dear. But Gershko was the Cyrillic equivalent of that. So we have that matching up. Gershko, a son of Berko. The ages were matching up with what we expected. And then there was a Pincus. So remember, the father of Isaac was Pincus, another brother of Mordko. So these are brothers. And sons of Pincus, Baruch and Itzko. Well, we're looking for Isaac. Isaac is Itzko. So we have all of the men here lining up. So now let's look at the other side of the page, which is the women. Once again, let's go to the English. And for the English, okay, so we have Menlia, mother of Mordko, Hasia, wife of Mordko, but now here, Hav Ides, daughter of Gershko, wife of Berko. So remember, parents of Harris, Ides and Bear, Barney, Dove Bear. Well, now here we have Berko with a wife, Hav Ides, so everything's lined up. Also, what was Pincus's wife? Simi, daughter of question mark, we couldn't translate it, but wife of Pincus. So we have everything in this record lining up with what we're expecting. And this was a record that allowed us to then take things back really, really far. Now, once again, even though this is an Ashkenazi family, all of this translates exactly over to the Sephardic stuff, just depending, what communities you're looking at, what you might be trying to find. So this record is a revision list, kind of similar to the bevolking registers in the Netherlands, which were basically a census record where they kind of would note things over time. So if someone moved, the name would be crossed out and you'll see a notation of moved or things like that, or if someone died. So because of this record, we were able to take the line of the family back to the 1700s. But even though we were able to do that, there is that question, is this hypothesis now proven? And I know for a lot of people, they'll be like, yes, it's definitely proven. I'm a little bit more hardcore. I really, really try to question things. And based on the genealogical proof standard, I would say not quite. There's still a bit more to prove. It's very strong. While everything matches up, there's just not enough correlating information to be 100% certain. It's always possible that this family we found living in Kiev with these same names, they're not uncommon names. Kazanovich, I mean, son of a Kazan is what it means. So that was a very commonly adopted family name. We know that the family adopted it because because of the revision list. We can take it back to the first revision list before they adopted the surname in the 1700s. So there is that question. So I like to say it's about 95% certain, very, very high confidence. But what can I do next? Further DNA testing to better confirm, getting other descendants from my side, other descendants from the other side, trying to find other Kazanovich branches. So like with my Sephardic family, part of what makes it so easy with the DNA matching versus my Ashkenazi side is just that our tree is so well built out that we have so many cousins to match against that it's really easy to tell right away. Whereas with a lot of the Ashkenazi families, because they can't build it out as easily, so if you come from a Sephardic family where you just can't build your family tree out as easily and you're kind of stuck in the 1800s, then you're going to be dealing with a lot of these issues. But as you can identify more descendants and get more descendants to test from the other branches, that can be helpful in triangulation, as well as just more documentation. The big thing I've been trying to look for is something that connects the paper trail from the US to the paper trail in Kiev. And so records from Kiev, US records, and just all sorts of various records. So I know that was a lot. And so that is the end of the presentation. I see a lot of stuff in chat. So I'll go ahead and open it up to questions.
Thank you. That was an absolute tour de force. I will actually have to watch the whole thing again. I mean, there was so much information there. I'm afraid we've massively overextended beyond our normal time. If anybody has a desperately urgent question, then please ask. Okay, I think, but Bernard, if you'd like to unmute, I think that needs to be our only question today. But many thanks, Bernard. Over to you.
Well, thank you, cousin. And it looks to me, I already knew that we were related, that we were 10th cousins once removed on my Dutch Ashkenazi side, but we appear to be 12th cousins removed on the Sephardic side. And just to share the names, because they may be of interest to other people here, our common ancestors on the Ashkenazi side are Carsten or Gershon Cohen Klot, who's my 9th and your 11th great-grandfather, and his wife Judith or Judith Jacobs. And on the Sephardic side, my 12th and your 13th great-grandmother was Violante Nunes Enriquez, and our 12th and 13th great-grandfather, Emmanuel Alvarez Lopez Pinto. So that's the statement. Now I've got a question. Okay. And my question is, it doesn't matter what I do with my autosomal DNA on my heritage and FTDNA, it shows me up as 120% Ashkenazi. And the maps that show where my family come from don't even reach the countries in which the last 5 or 6 generations of my mother's about 80% Sephardic family lived. And so it's to do with their reference bases. You talked about the need to do something similar for the Sephardic reference bases. Is anything happening? Because at the moment, in terms of mapping my history, they are completely useless. But if I do the hard genealogy work, I can see how we're related, and I can see that my mother's family was 80% Sephardic and mostly from Holland and Belgium. So what's happening there?
Well, one of the issues with the readouts they give is that they try to simplify so much information that a lot of the nuance gets kind of pushed out. So I especially hate how they do the map sometimes with the circles around all the different stuff, because it's often such a terrible representation of where a lot of those people actually lived, and it's very generalized. But with the question in terms of, are they actually doing a study? Because what really is needed is getting a lot of people with 100% or largely known Sephardic ancestry to try to identify, are there segments of DNA that are specific among Sephardic Jews versus Ashkenazi Jews or Mizrahi Jews or anything like that. But part of the difficulty is that there are so few who are truly 100%. I don't know if there are current studies being done. The best I could think is the Avatenu study, which for a while they were taking a lot of results beyond just Y chromosome results. But I know that their focus is basically kind of really honed in on the Y chromosome results, because that's where they're getting the really interesting stuff. And I think what they found mostly with the autosomal was that there just is so much overlap that it was like not worthwhile to look into. But a big difficulty is families like ours mixed with, granted, I'm a lot more Ashkenazi than Sephardi, but still, even with that little bit of Ashkenazi thrown in, it can be difficult.
Thanks, you're doing a great job. And by the way, I'm a maternal match to Adam Brown. So we share a very rare maternal DNA group.
Thank you, Bernard. And many thanks to Jarrett Ross for a fascinating presentation. Like David, I will watch it again and learn from it. I'm afraid that we have to leave that this, because we have gone way over time. But you showed your contact details. I hope people have preserved it. If not, I took a screenshot of that last slide. So if you want his contact details, send me a PM through Facebook or an email. Thank you, Jarrett, once again. And I hope to see you all in 2 weeks' time. I've not looked at our speakers list, but I'm sure we'll have a very interesting presentation. And as always, thanks to our patrons who make all of this possible. And thank you to our viewers on YouTube.
And thank you. Excellent.
Big thank you to Jeff.